right, in this Come Follow Me episode, this is part 2 of Alma 43 to 52. As you recall, we last left our hero, Captain Moroni, when he was creating the title of liberty out of his own robes, right? He was renting those, or his own robes, his own garment, a karat berit, and creating a covenant. So the banner that you see there that we have illustrations of is a covenant itself, right? It's being raised up as a covenant. And it's raised up eventually throughout the entire land of the Nephites that Moroni is claiming under this banner of liberty, under this title of liberty. So in a sense, he's creating a covenant land. And then those that join him throw their robes or garments out in front of him, probably as he's marching, to be trodden underfoot, and also a covenant that they are making to him, tying them to him and tying them to the land, right? So it's a covenant ritual that is happening here. And then you recall our foe, Amalekiah, has gathered as many people as will follow him to himself, but he sees that they are less numerous than those that will follow Moroni. So he now leaves, and he's going to head toward the Lamanites, again, where all of the dissenters go, where all of the antichrists go, right? Everybody against the doctrine of Christ. But remember, they have just lost a large portion of the Zoramites to the Lamanites. They don't want to now lose the Amalekiahites also to the Lamanites. They are in jeopardy of being overtaken by this new axis, right? Including the Lamanites themselves, the Amalekites, perhaps some of the Amlicites. I think actually they were different people. The descendants of the priests of Noah, the Zoramites, and now possibly the Amalekiahites. So Moroni takes his army to head off Amalekiah and his people that are following him before they get to the land of Nephi. And his aim is to put Amalekiah to death. So some moral issues there, right? Is this the right thing to do? He's taking judgment into his own hands, or is he? He's at least the people of the Nephites are taking it into their own hands, right? This is decided by the people that he is going to go do this. If further events here, later events, are a clue to us. And so they stop the Amalekiahites, and Moroni forces those people, or a majority of them. But Amalekiah, kind of like the priests of Noah, right? They take a small band, he takes a small band with him of his men, and they flee, right? They run away. And so Moroni, again, takes these people, or at least the men, and he commits them to a covenant here again. So we're getting, again, kind of this theme in this part of Mormon's abridgment, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on Mormon than the author here, who would be Helaman, because to me, anyway, it seems obvious that as we move from Alma's record to Helaman's record, that we get a lot more of the voice of Mormon here than we do of Helaman. And so he says, look, you're going to commit to a free government, or you're going to be put to death. So taking that ultimatum there and putting it into a contemporary scenario, that's hard for us to probably take. But they know that they're in trouble if they lose the Amalekiahites. And there are a few of the Amalekiahites who do not agree with this covenant, right? They're probably bloodthirsty. They are furious. They are full of hate. And they would rather die than give in, and rather die than support freedom. And so then Moroni causes that the title of liberty is hoisted up on every tower throughout all the land of the Nephites. Again, it's a covenant land. It's a promised land. It's kind of like, at this point, the national flag for the Nephites. And after this, in the church and in the land of the Nephites, all the lands, they have continual peace for 4 years. So Moroni has done his job. But Amalickiah, in the meantime, has gone to the land of Nephi, talked to the king of the Lamanites. Again, it's kind of interesting. We rarely ever get the name of the king of the Lamanites. And he riles the king up and those around him to go to battle against the Nephites. Here's another descending group, and you can think of all the arguments, right? He's going to talk about how horrible the Nephites are. He's going to talk about how their system of government is horrible, that some people might get left out sometimes, that you don't have someone who is appointed as the king, someone who is the rightful heir as king, running everything. You, king of the Lamanites, could be over all of their land. Think of your heritage with your fathers and how the fathers of the Nephites took the relics of the temple and left to go to this land here at first, the land of Nephi, and every reason in the world why the Lamanites have a hatred toward the Nephites, right? Pulling up ideas of oppression and other things that aren't true. But the majority of the Lamanites are not on board, and they are not willing to go to battle. And so the king of the Lamanites puts Amalickiah in charge of those that are willing to battle, a minority. And so now Amalickiah's design, because he wants to overthrow the king of the Lamanites and then overthrow the Nephites, right? He wants to be king over everybody, right? His whole goal is power. Well, those that did not want to fight, they leave what appears to be the land of the Lamanites, and they go to a place called Onidah, which is called the place of arms. Now, this may very well be the same place called Onidah in the land of the Zoramites, where Alma and others preached to the poor Zoramites. They were at Onidah. We don't know if it's the same place, but it would make sense, right? That those that don't want to fight, they go out of the land of the Lamanites to a more distant place, but that is still friendly to the Lamanites now in the land of the Zoramites. A good reference here for this also is Matthew Bowen at the Interpreter. He goes over a likely meaning for Onidah, but he only uses it in reference to Alma and his preaching. And he basically draws the conclusion, the likely conclusion, that Onidah means place of affliction or sorrow or humiliation, right, where the poor Zoramites are outside of the synagogues. Well, that would apply here as well, right, where those that are kind of cast out of their land, in a sense, the ones that don't want to fight, the Lamanites that don't want to fight, are go to a place called Onidah. So that would make sense. Now, again, we don't know it's the same place, but now here in the land or larger area of Onidah, there is a mount called Antipas, and this is where they gather, which is another interesting name that we get anciently, which in the Greek would mean something more like the Father or like my father. And this group does not want to be subject to fight against the Nephites, and so they set up their own king and they prepare to battle against the Lamanites, their own people. So Amalickiah, the sneaky Amalickiah, he sets up camp outside of this area. He sends several messages to their king, their leader, Lehonti, but he's not willing to go down to meet Amalickiah. So finally, Amalickiah goes up toward Lehonti's camp, and he says, look, come down, and by surprise, you can surround my men. I will set this up for you so that you can take them over. Remember that Amalickiah has a smaller army. So his design is to get the entire army under his command. So we're told that it's common that if the leader of the army dies, then the second in command is going to take over. So Amalickiah makes himself second in command, subject to Lehonti. And then he has his men administer little by little poison to Lehonti. And he dies, and of course, who becomes the new leader, the new commander. So then Amalickiah takes the entire army, the entire Lamanite army, marches back to the land of Nephi. And his men, some of his men go up before him to bow themselves before the king. The king thinking that, okay, way to go, Amalickiah. You've got everybody now in the army. You've done a great job. But one of those men, as he has bowed down before them, comes up and stabs the king in the heart. And then Amalickiah and his men make a big ruckus saying that it was one of the servants that killed the king of the Lamanites. And then we get a little bit more of a mixture here, right, between the Lamanites and the Nephites. So think of the mob rule here of what has just happened to the king of the Lamanites. The servants, and this would be people that would really be loyal, right, to the king of the Lamanites, they flee, they run, and they actually go over to the people of Ammon, to the anti-Nephi-Lehites, and join in with them. So again, we constantly get this back and forth of dissensions to the Lamanites, and fewer, but some dissensions from the Lamanites over to the Nephites. These are political groups. They're not races. We shouldn't look at it that way. And so now he's got command of the entire Lamanite army. The king is gone, and he's going to take his place, even unto marrying the queen. So we're told that he is now king of the entire people of the Lamanites, the political group, which includes all of the dissenters and all of the descendants of Laman and Lemuel and Ishmael, etc. But who are the most hardened of heart? It's the dissenters, of course, those that came from the group known as the Nephites. In verse 36 in chapter 47, it says here, "Now these dissenters, having the same instruction and the same information of the Nephites, yea, having been instructed in the same knowledge of the Lord, nevertheless, it is strange to relate. Not long after their dissensions, they became more hardened and impenitent, and more wild, wicked, and ferocious than the Lamanites, drinking in with the traditions of the Lamanites, giving way to indolence and all manner of lasciviousness, yea, entirely forgetting the Lord their God." Now, we can read that. That last phrase, the Lord their God, in Hebrew could very well be Jehovah, right? The Lord, Jehovah, their God. And as we know, all of the dissenters are anti-Christian. So Amalickiah now, as king of the Lamanites, he begins to incite all of the people against the Nephites. His hatred and ambition, right, are what drive him. And it's gotten him pretty far so far. So what does he do? Propaganda, right? He's going to disseminate propaganda throughout the entire land of the Nephites. It says here, he did appoint men to speak unto the Lamanites from their towers against the Nephites. Well, of course, as we know in political campaigns, right, what works better? All of the great things about Amalickiah or all of the horrible things about the opposition? What kind of political ads do we typically see, especially in this season, unfortunately? It's all of the negative against the opponent. Down in verse 4, "For he was determined, because of the greatness of the number of his people," the Lamanites, "to overpower the Nephites and to bring them into bondage," lose their liberty. And so he appoints chief captains of the Zoramites because they are the most acquainted with the ways of the Nephites. They are the more recent dissenters, right? And larger group than the Amalickiahites are. And they're going to know about their weakest positions. So with Amalickiah and the Zoramites going after power and subjecting the Nephites to bondage, we get this, again, these opposite sides here that are clarified over and over again by Mormon. He says here in verse 7, "Now it came to pass while Amalickiah had thus been obtaining power by fraud and deceit." Remember that power, we can look at that as glory and the war in heaven, right? And what is Lucifer's position in the war in heaven? It's flattening the hierarchy and it's gaining power. And that's where a lot of the movements today are. Now, that's always been an issue, but it's becoming more and more of an issue with the philosophies that are, especially in the West, starting to gain some traction, where things have no meaning and everything is based off a power dynamic. So Moroni, on the other hand, had been preparing the minds of the people to be faithful unto the Lord their God. There we get Lord their God again. So very opposite motives here. And we're told here, as we move further and further into these war chapters now, that he had been strengthening the armies of the Nephites and erecting small forts or places of resort, throwing up banks of earth round about to enclose his armies, and also building walls of stone to encircle them about, round about their cities and the borders of their lands, yea, all around about the land. So again, we get this idea of Captain Moroni here. What is his entire focus? It is preparing the minds of the people to be faithful to the Lord, right? Obeying the commandments so that you can prosper in the land. That's a very big thing that we're pulling over all the way from Alma's words to his sons. And defending their liberty and their religion. So as we go through these war chapters here, and I've heard this a lot as we go through these, and whether it's in CES or other places, and it's a very valid point, but a lot of it has to do with individual protection, right, against evil. But I think that we should not just individualize what's happening here with the war chapters, but we need to put it into a societal framework as well, where certainly individually applies to us all the time. It's likely going to come to pass, if you will, that the ideas here in these war chapters, not necessarily of the temporal strategies that Moroni comes up with, but the attitudes, the obedience, and the idea of protecting liberty and religion are what are going to have to really be focused on by the people, by the church, and by society. So again, here in verse 10, it says, "And thus he was preparing to support their liberty, their lands, their wives, and their children, and their peace, and that they might live unto the Lord their God, and that they might maintain that which was called by their enemies the cause of the Christians." Again, this is so fascinating to me. It's just over and over again. Moroni is not just putting out this idea here, right? We're not gaining this idea, this coupling of Christianity and the doctrine of Christ with liberty. And just saying, oh, here's a couple of messages from Mormon. No, this is a primary focus of Mormon, right? What is the cause of the Christians? Well, it's their liberty and their religion. This is what we need to identify in the Book of Mormon. This is what is going to come under attack if we read this properly, I believe, right? In my estimation. And then, of course, we get Mormon here talking about Moroni with glowing reviews, so much so that he names his son after Captain Moroni. He says here in verse 11 of 48, "And Moroni was a strong and a mighty man. He was a man of a perfect understanding. Yea, a man that did not delight in bloodshed, a man whose soul did joy in the liberty and the freedom of his country, and his brethren from bondage and slavery." And you got to think about these people that rise to the top like this. You know, how important this is, how people's lives are so important to them. That they have this kind of a cause, that they risk their lives and that they put themselves out there to be leaders for liberty and for Christianity. And he gives us this as well in 13. "Yea, and he was a man who was firm in the faith of Christ, and he had sworn with an oath." I come back to this in a minute here. He had sworn with an oath. Remember our whole theme here, what's happening in this time period here of the record of Helaman, this theme of covenant. He had sworn with an oath to defend his people, his rights, and his country, and his religion, even to the loss of his blood. So, what do we get with an oath? What do we get with a covenant? Well, it's blood, right? You've heard of a blood oath. That's not some strange kind of an oath. That is part of covenant, typically, right? With the animals cut in half, well, obviously there's blood. If we're cutting their throat, obviously there's blood. The whole idea of the Day of Atonement with the high priest, it's making a covenant of peace with the Lord and for all of the land of the Israelites, right? It's a blood oath. So he mentions covenant here again, or oath, and then he mentions the loss of his blood. I'm going to come back to that. And then some more rules on, kind of spiritual rules on war. He says, the Nephites were taught never to give an offense, yea, or an offense, right? Never move toward conquering another people. And never to raise the sword, except it were against an enemy, except it were to preserve their lives. So that's part of the law of war, according to Mormon. Why? Because if you were going to an offense, right, if you were going to conquer, well, then that's tyranny. That's the exact opposite of what he's talking about here. And then finally, in his review here, he says about Moroni in 17, yea, verily, verily, I say unto you, if all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, right? He's talking about this fervor of defense of liberty and his religion. Behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. Yea, the devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. But of course, most are not like Moroni. Now, I want to bring up a phrase here because this is something that's very common with members of the church that I've found, that as you read the Book of Mormon, you think you have a different idea of who the Lamanites are, right? It says here, but as I have said, in the latter end of the 19th year, that's of the reign of Judges, yea, notwithstanding their peace among themselves, that's the Nephites, they were compelled reluctantly to contend with their brethren, the Lamanites. So we read over those things, and again, we think of the descendants of Laman, Lemuel, and Ishmael. But really, the enforcers, the leaders of the pack, are dissenters. That's who the real force behind the Lamanites is. It's Nephites. It's those from within. And again, we're told often that the Lamanites are there, which is true, right, to be a reminder. But who are the Lamanites? I think we need to change our minds a little bit on that, right? They're a reminder for the Nephites to stay righteous. But it's really the dissenters that are usually the problem here. We get this right here in verse 24. Nevertheless, they could not suffer to lay down their lives, this is the Nephites, that their wives and their children should be massacred by the barbarous cruelty of those who were once their brethren. Yea, and had dissented from their church. This is a big focus, right? Again, this is a holy war in many ways. And had left them and had gone to destroy them by joining the Lamanites. Now, with all of the cities and the battles, I'm not going to go over all of those. I don't think this is the right place to do that. But I do want to focus on a few things here where we're going to dip down into chapters 49 through 52. So the Amalickiahites, they actually go to the land of Onidah. Well, we know where Onidah is, right? Where Alma and Mulek were. Well, that city, since it was destroyed previously by the Lamanites, has been rebuilt. But it's been fortified. And so the Lamanites, as they go to each of these cities and see how they've been fortified, they're astonished at what they see because they've never seen this before on either side, right? Again, it's the message of defense. It's the focus on the defense of liberty and the defense of religion. Words that are very much brought up more and more by the brethren, by the way. Now, we're going to get something that goes hand in hand with this name of Amalickiah oftentimes. I've said this previously in the episode that I did on the Amlicites, Amalekites, and Amalickiahites, where they do have the MLK in their names. And possibly this is a reference to the Mulekites, and that's mostly who the dissenters are, which is very likely. It may not be the reason for their names being so similar. Very possibly it is, but there's another option here. We get here in verse 10 of chapter 49. It says, now if King Amalickiah had come down out of the land of Nephi. Notice that Nephi now is kind of the center of everything for the Lamanites. Remember, the land of Nephi is where Nephi had taken his group when they ran from the Lamanites originally, in the original setting where Lehi landed, or wherever they had settled. And he built the temple there in Nephi after the design of the Temple of Solomon. This is where Zenith goes back to, and his son King Noah is at in Nephi. This is where Abinadi preaches. But it becomes the center of things for the Lamanites. But he says here that he came down from the land of Nephi, that perhaps he would have caused the Lamanites to have attacked the Nephites at the city of Ammonihah. For behold, he did care not for the blood of his people. So the letters AML that we get in Amlicites, Amalekites, and Amalickiahites has a very close reference in Hebrew to blood, to being bloodthirsty, in fact. So we get his name here in this verse, Amalickiah, with he did care not for the blood of his people. We're going to come back to that again as well. Remember that we've gone through this whole thing with covenant, right? And that blood is a part of that. And so there's a reference back to this idea of renting of the scalp of Zarahemnah. There's no blood with the title of liberty or for the garments that are thrown out there, but they're rent, right? They're broken, they're cut. So this blood is part of this whole idea, this pervasive idea of covenant that we've been going over here in these war chapters so far. So with these leaders of the Zoramites, they know that Ammonihah is one of the weaker cities. Well, not anymore. So they move on to the city of Noah. Well, not anymore. That's also fortified. And here at the city of Noah, Moroni has put Lehi, the commander Lehi, the one who was on the east bank of the river Sidon before, with the Lamanites, when they had surrounded the Lamanites, with Zarahemnah, right? So the Lamanites are freaked out about this. They are very concerned. They know how Lehi and his band of brothers fight. So they have to save face. So they're going to attack the city of Noah regardless. And so they go up, trying to go up these embankments of dirt, and they lose over 1,000 souls. Well, the chief captains are all killed in this process here at the land of Noah, the Zoramites, while there was not a single Nephite who was lost. So again, what is our spiritual lesson here? As certainly Mormon is trying to tell us about a spiritualized war here and battles. Well, the spiritualized concept here is that we are well defended against the adversary. And how do we do that? What do we do individually and as a society, as a church, as a nation, whatever nation we are from, to defend ourselves spiritually, to defend our liberty and to defend our religion? Well, Amalickiah has not been out to battle with the armies. He's been back at the land of Nephi, enjoying his new life as king. And we get this also. It says that Amalickiah was a Nephite by birth. So the question there is, if it matters, was he a Nephite by descendancy, by blood, or was he a political Nephite? Was he a Mulekite? Like many of the dissenters certainly were. And if he is a Nephite by birth, it seems like they are talking about blood here, then the MLK in his name does not mean that he is a Mulekite, but may have something to do more with blood, which makes a lot of sense with all this covenant talk that's going on around this time of Amalickiah. So again, down here in verse 27, with Amalickiah, we get this. He was exceedingly wroth at his army, and he did curse God and also Moroni, swearing with an oath that he would drink his blood. Right? There we get oath and blood again. And this because Moroni had kept the commandments of God in preparing for the safety of his people. It's an interesting way for Mormon to put that. He's stating that because Moroni is responsible and that he's doing what's right and he's obeying the commandments, that he has defended himself and his people very well. And that makes Amalickiah furious. And again, juxtaposition here. He says that the people of Nephi did thank the Lord their God because of his matchless power in delivering them from the hands of their enemies. And then here in chapter 50, we get a little bit of a rest from Amalickiah, but more dissenters among the land of the Nephites. There's a little bit of a contention between those that are of the land of Lehi and those that are of the land of Morianton. And Morianton's going to cause some problems here. He's the leader of those at Morianton. And we get the introduction of Teancum, who is leading an army here to battle those of Morianton, who are going to dissent. It's a problem. They're actually up in the north. And if you can imagine, you have more dissenters up in the north. They're not going to allow that, right? They're not going to allow anything up from the south to be dissenters. There's no way they can do that. At least the Zoramites are at the very south end here, down with the Lamanites. But to be surrounded on both sides, no way they can allow that. But Teancum is introduced to us as a military leader, and he's kind of a special ops guy. We can think of him that way. We learn a little bit more about him and Amalickiah here shortly. And we get a little bit of strategy here about the lands of the Lamanites and of the Nephites. And this is probably pretty important to understand as part of the conflict here between the two political groups. This is Moroni. It says in 50:10, and he also placed armies on the south, that's the border with the Lamanites, in the borders of their possessions, and caused them to erect fortifications that they might secure their armies and their people from the hands of their enemies. All right, makes sense, right? That's the Nephite front. And thus he cut off all the strongholds of the Lamanites in the east wilderness, yea, and also on the west, fortifying the line between the Nephites and the Lamanites, between the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi, are the two capitals. From the west sea running by the head of the river Sidon, the Nephites possessing all the land northward, yea, even all the land which was northward of the land bountiful, according to their pleasure. So in other words, what is he doing? He's cutting off the access as much as possible for the Lamanites to come from the south up to the north. Now, this may have always been a problem. What is it? Is there something additional that causes the conflict here? Are there more resources to the north? Is there better agriculture? Is there less of a place to go for the Lamanites down south? This could very possibly be an additional part of this conflict here of the Lamanites easily being stirred up to go north. Now, of course, they may have better cities and more order in place with the Nephites, and that might be what they're after. They want to take that. Now, the other thing we get in this chapter 50 here is that Nephite, who has been the chief judge, that he dies and Pahoran replaces him. And we're going to talk about Pahoran here a little bit more next week. But here's an interesting point that comes up here. And again, we're going to get covenant or oath right here. In verse 38, we're told, nevertheless, this is Nephite, he had refused Alma to take possession of those records and those things which were esteemed by Alma and his fathers to be most sacred. So Helaman apparently is the second choice on this. And he was actually going to be giving it to the king. And maybe that's where it kind of is supposed to be, or the chief judge. I mean, Alma was originally the chief judge. And it's Mosiah, the king, who gave him the records and the relics, the emblems of the temple. So Alma might be saying, hey, I had these as the chief judge originally, even though I gave that up. And so I'm going to be passing this along to Nephite, who is the chief judge. But Nephite refuses them. And so Alma gives them to his son Helaman. And so Pahoran is the son, by the way, of Nephite. And that's what we get continually. And that may be part of the conflict of the dissenters as well, is that they are led by the Nephites by blood, right? Not by the Mulekites. And the Mulekites may feel that they are the true royal blood because they are Judahites. And the son of Zedekiah, Mulek, the founder of their people, was the rightful heir to the throne of Judah. But here also in 39, we get just another mention here as Pahoran replaces his father Nephite. It says, Yea, he was appointed chief judge and governor over the people with an oath and sacred ordinance to judge righteously, to keep the peace and the freedom of the people. We see this whole idea again of oath and liberty going together, or oath and tyranny, and to grant unto them their sacred privileges to worship the Lord their God, yea, to support and maintain the cause of God all his days, and to bring the wicked to justice according to their crimes. So again, the oath here is tied together with liberty. Then, surprise, surprise, in chapter 51, we get more dissenters. And what do they want? Well, pretty much the same thing everybody else has wanted. They want to take power. This time, instead of being the Lord judges or some of the power of the people, this time it's the elites. It's the rich. It's the wealthy. It's those that are of high birth. And this could be Mulekites, or it could be Nephites, or both. But it's the elite that are rebelling at this point, and these are the kingmen. And they go to government and they ask for Pahoran to make some changes to the law. Well, of course, everybody wants, when they want something for themselves, they want to start subtly moving it toward that direction. Move the football down. Let's get a first down here. We don't need a touchdown to start. Let's get a first down and then another first down, and eventually we will score. But Pahoran won't do it, right? He doesn't make any changes, and the people haven't supported it. But the kingmen, as they're called now, want to dethrone, so to speak, Pahoran and put somebody else in his stead. They want to overthrow, as we're told here in verse 5 of 51, overthrow the free government and to establish a king over the land. Right? So they also want to take away liberty, government, a free government. And those that supported Pahoran and wanted freedom and liberty in the government, they're called freemen. So you've got more division here. And we get this in verse 6. And thus was the division among them. For the freemen had sworn or covenanted to maintain their rights and the privileges of their religion by a free government. Covenant again. So they have what might be a referendum, and the voice of the people through their voting vote to keep Pahoran in as the chief judge. Well, the kingmen aren't having any of it. They don't believe in a free government to begin with. And this is a very difficult time to be going through this type of a dissension. We're told that Amalickiah had again stirred up the hearts of the people of the Lamanites against the people of the Nephites. And he was gathering together soldiers from all parts of his land and arming them and preparing for war with all diligence. And then we get this again, for he had sworn to drink the blood of Moroni, A-M-L. And then 10, but behold, we shall see that his promise, that's the oath, that's an oath, which he made was rash. Nevertheless, he did prepare himself and his armies to come to battle against the Nephites. And this time he's going to lead the army himself. And then we get this again, right? Now the kingmen aren't actually going to end up with the Lamanites, but they want to, right? Verse 13, and it came to pass that when the men who were called kingmen had heard that the Lamanites were coming down to battle against them, they were glad in their hearts, and they refused to take up arms. For they were so wroth with the chief judge, and also with the people of liberty, he's calling them, that's Mormon, that they would not take up arms to defend their country. Right? They're siding with the enemy. Right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, so to speak. Again, dissension from within. It's a cancer. So Moroni's furious about this, and he gets the consent of the people. Again, Mormon is very specific about constantly going over this idea of consent from the people and the voice of the people. And he gets it from the voice of the people that down in 16, it says, and it came to pass that it was granted according to the voice of the people. What was granted? His first care to put an end to such contentions and dissensions among the people. For behold, this had been hitherto a cause of all their destruction. So Moroni takes the army and he goes after the kingmen and slays a number of them. In fact, 4,000 of these dissenters were slain. And the leaders are taken into prison to be tried at another point. Not right now. They're too busy getting ready for Amalickiah to come. And this is interesting, especially in our times today, regardless of what your opinion is on this political opinion, but this is kind of interesting, right? In chapter 51, verse 20, and the remainder of those dissenters, rather than be smitten down to the earth by the sword, yielded to the standard of liberty, the banner, and were compelled to hoist the title of liberty upon their towers and in their cities, and to take up arms in defense of their country. So again, we get this idea of these dissenters that want to destroy from within the Nephites and the religion. 21, and thus Moroni put an end to those kingmen, that there were not any known by the appellation or name of kingmen. They're done. And thus he put an end to the stubbornness and the pride of those people who professed the blood of nobility. But they were brought down to humble themselves like unto their brethren, and to fight valiantly for their freedom from bondage. I mean, again, once you get, even if people aren't motivated, you get them into a position of battle, you better believe they're going to fight, right? They're fighting at least for their own lives. Now, Amalickiah comes in to play here again, and he goes and he takes the new city of Moroni. There are several new cities, and these cities are smaller. And Amalickiah and his army, they start plowing through some of these small cities, and they possess them. And then they get to the land bountiful with all this momentum generated, but there again is Teancum. And Teancum has a very special unit. This is like the Navy SEALs, the Green Berets. In chapter 51:31, but behold, he met with a disappointment, that being Amalickiah, by being repulsed by Teancum and his men, for they were great warriors. For every man of Teancum did exceed the Lamanites in their strength and in their skill of war, insomuch that they did gain advantage over the Lamanites. So where does that skill of war come? Well, some of it comes from experience, but Teancum is probably a leader of training as well, right? He's got these men ready to go. So after this battle, from the heat of the day, we're guessing this is during the summertime, the Amalickiahites, they pitch their tents out by the seashore, not far from the land bountiful, and Teancum by night, while everyone's just drained of energy and sleeping, goes into the tent of Amalickiah, takes a javelin or spear, and puts it through the heart of Amalickiah. And before Amalickiah can say anything, he's dead. And so Teancum then sneaks right back out of their camp and comes back and advises his men of what he has just done. So Amalickiah's brother, Ammoron, takes over. We get a little bit of a geography lesson here of the land of the Nephites in verse 9 of 52. And he also sent orders unto him that he should fortify the land bountiful and secure the narrow pass. This is unlikely the narrow neck of land. This is something different, more than likely, which led into the land northward, lest the Lamanites should obtain that point and should have power to harass them on every side. So again, trying to keep everything as far south as possible and among the borders of the seashores where these smaller cities were that the Lamanites have overtaken. And then here in 52, we get Moroni and Teancum teaming up to try and retake the city of Mulek. And Mulek has a leader who is a Zoramite called Jacob. And Moroni asks for Jacob to come out with his army and to fight them out in the plains. Well, Jacob's not going to do it. So they devise a strategy wherein Teancum takes a small number of men, right, elite fighters. They go out on the east side of Mulek on the seashore area, and the spies of the Lamanites and of Jacob see how small a number they are, and they go out, they take the armies out, their army out, and chase Teancum and his men. Well, in the meantime, Moroni comes in from the west. He puts some of his army into the city of Mulek. They slay those that will not give up their weapons of war. It's interesting that Mormon always says this. They give them the chance to give up their weapons of war. But they slay those that won't, probably take captive those that do. And Moroni leaves part of his army there in Mulek to hold it, and then goes to Teancum and the battle there. Well, then we also have Lehi and a small army there. The Lamanites turn to fight against the Lehites, get back to Mulek and make sure that they are holding on to the possession of their city. They don't realize that Moroni is coming upon the rear. And now again, Moroni's got them surrounded with his army and Lehi's army, similar to what he did at the River Sidon. And as the Lamanites are losing, Moroni does the same thing. He allows those that are willing to give up their swords to be spared. And those that don't, well, this time they're taken and bound as prisoners, a very large number of them. So again, as we go through these war chapters, I think the important thing to understand in this spiritualizing of these temporal wars is to understand the position that Moroni, Captain Moroni, and Mormon take in their unfettered defense of their liberty and of their religion. And if there's a single lesson to be drawn out of this, aside from, looking at the specifics of the strategies and the earth being thrown up and the fortifications of all the cities, it's that liberty and our religion are precious. And that this book, the Book of Mormon, was written for us in our time because those things are under attack and will be much more under attack. Or so it seems to me. So even though Captain Moroni is an amazing figure, of a military figure, what Mormon loves about him is that he will do anything to defend religion, the freedom of religion, and to be faithful to Christ, and to defend the liberty of his people. I'll talk to you next time.